Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast. We're going to look at the role of timber in construction. As we ever become more aware of the role of carbon in our industry and the drive for sustainability across all sections of the economy, timber is going to have to play a greater role. We're very grateful that Andrew Carpenter, Chief Executive of the Structural Timber Association, is here with us today and is going to help us chart a course through these particular challenges. Andrew, good afternoon.
Hello, Mark. Nice to be here.
So, Andrew, what we normally do is just in your own words, sort of say who you are and what your organisation is, and then what your role is in trying to promote the industry and particularly sustainability in construction.
Yeah, okay, happy to do that. So I'm Andrew Carpenter. Main role is Chief Executive of the Structural Timber Association, a role that I've been in now for 14 years. I've been in the UK construction industry for 47 years, I have to say. Most of that time in the supply chain, but also heavily involved, as you know, with constructing excellence for the last 26 years. And currently I'm Chief Executive of Constructing Excellence in the Midlands. But I also sit on the Construction Leadership Council Construct Zero board, and I'm lead secretariat for DEFRA's Timber in Construction Roadmap. So I think as you get older, you collect responsibilities.
Well, you're clearly the ideal man to talk us through this, through timber in construction, with those fingers in all those pies. So let's start off with, so how big's the industry, Andrew? How much, how big is the role of structural timber in our industry?
Well, the industry is probably a lot bigger than our viewers and listeners would expect. But the latest figures that I have from the Office of National Statistics is that there's over 8.5 billion in the forestry stroke timber products sector. And it's within the top 20 sectors within the UK. So it's much bigger than we'd expect. And we employ directly about 150,000 people. And that equates to about 10% of all construction jobs. So we go under the radar a bit, Mark, because most of our members are what you might call SMEs versus concrete and steel, which are big players. Mm-hmm. We're a much sort of an SME orientated business with very few large businesses in the mix. There are some, but mostly we're in the SME field.
And where are those businesses? What are those businesses doing? I mean, structural timber covers a huge area, and 8.5 billion it must do. Do you want to just give everybody a sort of understanding of what structural timber actually encompasses?
Yeah, I mean, as the Structural Timber Association, we concentrate in three main areas. The first is around design, so design of buildings, design of structural timber. The second is around the manufacture of those systems, and then thirdly around the erection or installation of those systems. But then either side of that, we have a wide array of what you might call associates. So people that stem right from the forestry side that actually grow the trees, the sawmilling side, and then at the other end, we work closely with clients, with house builders, with architects, with engineers. So we do really offer a sort of a front to back opportunity for people that are interested in structural timber to get engaged wherever they wish. And the sort of things that we help is obviously technical information, health and safety, particularly around fire and durability. We're very heavy on something called STA Assure, which is our quality assurance system. And then obviously again around, particularly post Grenfell, a huge emphasis on skills, competency and so on. So a wide, very wide sector. We sit firmly in the middle, but we do offer help and a guidance to those either side.
And Andrew, do you cover both the frame and the panelling, or are you predominantly one or the other?
So we are, if you look at Mark Farmer's definitions of off-site, we sit very firmly in category 2, which is the panelised system. So that's what we represent, and that's that's an industry that's been around a long time. I mean, we call it modern methods of construction. I think a better term in our case would be mature methods of construction, because we've been around a long time. And unlike the category one, the volumetric section, which has had a few problems more recently, unfortunately, the category two section is going well. And my members are experiencing quite significant market growth at the moment, as we see timber becoming very much the building material of choice.
Yeah, yeah. So your members will be designing and erecting timber frame buildings, the panelized systems that we see increasingly across construction,
Yeah.
And then advising and supporting how they should be looked after and designed for longevity within their buildings.
That's right. That's absolutely
Brilliant.
right. Yeah.
Brilliant. So if we're doing 8.5 billion at the moment, and we've got to be a net zero industry by 2050 and probably a little bit earlier, what's that going to go up to in today's money? What are we looking at an increase of?
The sorts of figures that are being bandied around at the moment, and as I mentioned earlier, I sit on the government's timber and construction roadmap, and we look at figures, say, like from the Environmental Audit Committee. Now, at the moment, let's take housing, because housing is really the only sector where we measure properly. At the moment, 23% of all homes in the UK are built in timber frame. Now, that's skewed quite heavily because 90% of homes in Scotland are timber frame, but only 10% in England. So there's quite an emphasis north of the border. If we take the Environmental Audit Committee's desire, they want to see that overall figure in the UK increase to 40% as a minimum. Ideally, they'd like to see it rise to 80%. And the reason they put that figure in is because their view is, well, if we can do it north of the border, why can't we do it in Wales and Ireland? So we're looking to probably, in the structural timber frame sector, look to, in England, to quadruple what we're doing in timber frame, but overall in the UK to just about double. So now it's not a straightforward sum, doubling the 8.5 billion to make it 17. It's not quite as simple as that. But those are the sorts of figures that we're looking at. Now, that's only in housing. We're also looking at other sectors. So education, we're looking at health, we're looking at student accommodation, care homes, and so on, where maybe steel and concrete are being used currently. And we have to look at mass timber as a possible opportunity. And the amount of mass timber that's used in the UK at the moment is minimal. So the opportunities there are huge. And if you listened to Kevin MacLeod in the TV program he did around Christmas time, he was saying that the three biggest emitters of carbon in this world is air, traffic, then steel and concrete. So that was quite a message to come from him. And up until recently, the CLC wouldn't put their head above the turret in terms of giving specific advice, but the latest edict from them, advice to clients, is that they need to minimize the amount of steel and minimize the amount of concrete. So I think for the first time, people are acknowledging that we have to state these things, which obviously for us as a sector is wonderful. But we are looking seriously beyond the commercial aspects of this, because if we're successful, if we succeed, obviously it's good for us, but it's good for the planet. Yeah. And I know that sounds twee, but that's the agenda we're all on at the moment, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's all about resilience for the whole economy, not just one particular sector.
Indeed.
Andrew, you mentioned there mass timber construction. Do you want to just explain a little bit about that? Because it is slightly different, isn't it?
Yeah, so very different and relatively new to the UK. Mass timber stands for cross laminated timber. It's a different system, and is stronger in that you can build to much higher heights. I mean, in the UK, probably the best examples of cross laminated timber projects are in Hackney. There are about 10 to 12 high-rise accommodation blocks that were built in association with Hackney Council that go up to 10 stories. So we know it can be done. In other parts of Europe, it goes up a little bit higher to about 13 stories in places like Norway. We were heading in that direction until Grenfell. And then obviously, after that tragedy, quite rightly, we took a hard look at everything we do in construction, not just timber, but every method of construction, quite rightly, came under the microscope. So if you like, what we're doing at the moment is we're building back that confidence to prove that you can build in mass timber safely, which is the important factor. So as well as sustainable, it has to be safe. In fact, the government's timber and construction roadmap that I now lead, back when we started nearly three years ago, the original objective was to increase the amount of timber used in construction, and I insisted the government put the word safely in, because my view is that we've got the two biggest agenda items of my lifetime at the moment, one being the net zero agenda and the other being the building safety agenda. And I don't think you can have a net zero solution that's not safe, and you can't have a safety solution that doesn't meet net zero criteria. So I'm pleased to say the government have bought into that, and the objective now is to safely use more timber in construction.
Yeah, I mean, 10 stories of timber is, you probably, for those of us who aren't familiar with the sector, would have been unimaginable post Grenfell. But do you want to just give us a quick some of the issues that you now assess on a timber frame high-rise building? I mean, that's going to come into one of the 18-meter category quite quickly, and obviously timber is seen as, during construction, as a risky material, and there are all sorts of things that we need to do. And I know most competent contractors are doing. But do you want to just tell people how some of the techniques we use to overcome the challenges or the problems that arise?
I mean, I think really, Mark, the best thing to do is just to take you through the 7 chapters of the roadmap, because what we did there was actually to look at what the barriers are, and then look at what the solutions are to those barriers. I mean, so the 7 headings that we looked at, and some of them are not relevant to this question, but I'll just touch on them and answer the others in more detail. But the inevitably, the first one we looked at was carbon. Well, that's pretty much a no-brainer.
Yep.
In as much as that's, if you like, timber's unique selling point, and the reason I'm sitting here in this podcast. But we do have to look wider than just the building material. So we have to look at the environmental declaration that people make. So in terms of, how do these businesses carry out their business? Is that done in an environmental way? So that's something we're looking at. We're looking at demand. How do we increase demand? Now, in low-rise housing, so that's already underway. People like Barratt's have bought one of my members, are building a new timber frame factory. Taylor Wimpey are building a new timber frame factory. Carla bought one of my members, and so on. I could go on. So the low-rise housing, I think they're already in play. But obviously, what we need to do with the mass timber market is we're really looking at the bigger developers, the people that are going to build in the conurbations that need to build upwards, so to speak, up to 8, 10 stories. So what we've done is we've created a working group with the developers and the insurance industry to understand what the insurance industry main concerns are, and try and find solutions to give that confidence. And the early responses, there are 2. One is fire safety, and the second one is durability. And so we're working on both those areas quite significantly. We created recently a fire safety hub, which developers, designers, contractors can go to, which is a one-stop shop to give help and technical advice for anyone that's thinking of using timber for the first time, in terms of what they have to consider. Because let's be honest, Mark, if a project, irrespective of the material, is designed properly and built properly, it will be safe. It's only when things don't go to plan, and that applies to any material, that we see problems, and that could either be problems in design, or it could be problems on site with erectors and installers and so on. So that's an area of demand. We're looking at supply, because at the moment most of our timber for the structural timber sector comes from abroad, very little homegrown. About 40% of all timber in the UK for construction as a whole is homegrown, but in my sector it will be less than 5%. Most of it coming from Scandinavia, Sweden, Austria, and so on. So we need to work with the Forestry Commission, Forestry, to make sure that, if you like, they're growing trees that my members can use. But even if we're successful in doing that, that won't happen for another 60 years. So we have to understand those things. Two of the other areas we're looking at, one is around safety and one's around insurance. I've touched on them briefly, but we're also looking at skills, because one of the issues, Mark, is that many folks haven't built timber buildings, whether that be mass timber or timber frame. So we have to give help and advice to them, which we're prepared to do, and we're working again as part of this government roadmap with the CITB. And then finally, around innovation, because it's very important that I mentioned earlier in the conversation that most of my members are SMEs. We have to give them, if you like, the incentive to innovate, to do more in the factory, for example, with things like PMV, to add insulation in the factory, to add windows in the factory, and so on and so forth.
Just you better just tell people what PMV is, because otherwise
yeah, it's pre-manufactured value.
There we go.
It's another Mark Farmer-ism, which people like Homes England have really bought into. So they require a minimum of 55% PMV for all their off-site projects. So what we try and do as a sector is educate our members on a lot of these things that are needed coming through. And again, I mentioned earlier, a lot of them are SMEs, so they don't have enough resource to have people back at base, if you like, that are able to do this work for them individually. So we do it as a sector.
Yeah. So Andrew, just picking up on a couple of things you said there, you've got a sort of advisory service that you're providing around fire safety. Is that going to cover both construction as well as operation, so that you get the designs right? Because if we're main contractors are looking to get into timber frame, the fire safety is a key one, and certainly insurance is having a clear run at how to solve the insurance challenge during construction is something that I know most people have concerns over. So will that advisory service provide that level of information and support?
Indeed it will, Mark. When I came into this role just about 14 years ago, the big ticket item at the time was fire during construction. There'd been some significant fires in the noughties, and the STA, or what was the UK TFA at the time, realised and recognised that we had to do something to alleviate that problem. I mean, in all honesty, Mark, it was tended to be happening during school holidays. And it was a lot of people who thought it was good fun to go and set fire to a construction site, and because it was timber, it was easy pickings, if you like. So in 2011, we created some separation guidance, which was launched and is now considered as best practice guidance, and that's had a significant improvement in terms of the fires on site. In fact, you may have recognised that in terms of newsworthy items, it's now disappeared, because this separation guidance is being used. We've also got something called 16 Steps to Fire Safety, which is a how-to guide, and particularly for those new to timber frame, we would go through that in depth and in detail with a contractor member in terms of what to do if you're building in timber.
Brilliant. Okay, I mean, clearly a key aspect is that fire and getting it insurable and understand what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, on the insurance front, we've taken to having a member of the insurance sector now sit on our board. So we're working very closely with them. And again, When I took over, anyone who wanted to talk about fire was seen as the enemy. I completely changed that around with the help of my board, because obviously, if anyone's got an issue, what we want to do is find a solution.
Yeah.
And that's how we're seen now. We're not seen as part of the problem, but we're seen as part of the solution, which has been quite a significant sea change in culture, not only for my members, but also for the industry in terms of how we're perceived.
I think we're getting better at collaboration across the board throughout construction as we are at the moment.
Fingers crossed, Mark. You and I have been at that for 2 decades or more.
And we'll get there eventually. Can I come on to something else you mentioned, Andrew? Was durability,
Yeah.
because I was doing timber frame in the 80s in the housing, and we're using Swedish systems, and the Swedish timber frame systems were a very high standard of workmanship to be able to ensure the durability of the long-term durability of the frame. Do you think you've got the skills in the sector at the moment to ensure that the detail you need to build into those frames is going to be adequate for the long-term durability? I mean, it's water vapors gets everywhere if you're not careful, and that attention to detail is absolutely crucial on your sort of structures.
Yeah, I make several points there, if I may. First of all, timber as a material has been around for hundreds of years. In fact, if you look at what you might call traditional construction, if you think back, timber is probably it, although it's not how we describe it. So there are timber buildings that have been around and are structurally sound for hundreds of years. However, I know the point that you're making. You mentioned the high quality of the Swedish systems. Again, we acknowledge that we can take best practice from Sweden and other places. And with that in mind, we've got a member of Swedish Wood on our board.
All right. Okay.
So, like with insurance, we are acknowledging we can take best practice from areas. But what I would say is that since the 80s, things have moved on quite significantly in our sector, as they have in other the construction sector. So what we're using now is far more sophisticated in many cases than it was 40 years ago. Many of my members now have got fully automated systems, with robots and so on. So, if your members wanted to come and have a look around some of our members' factories, I think they'd be blown away with what they see versus maybe what they have in their mind of the timber frame sector. Yeah. So I'm fully confident that, again, going back to my point on safety, if a project is designed properly and then installed properly, there is no problem with durability.
So, and for me, I mean, I get the control that you can do in the factory for your members. It is the site skills which I often worry about. Because have we got the skills on site to be able to install it and make sure that the systems that are required for timber frame are installed accurately and correctly, and probably recorded as such. I mean, you see that what we now do for recording fire stops around buildings. Are we getting to a situation where we're designing that closely to the knuckle on timber frame? We're going to have to do the same sort of records for water member vapor barriers and the like.
Well, most of my members now photograph everything they do and record that. So that happens in our sector as well. But we've put a huge emphasis on the erectors and installers, Mark. We've got a new sort of education program, skills program for our erectors and installers. And we've got about 350 companies now on our database of timber frame erectors, and we insist at the moment that 2/3 of their staff go through an audited examination. The reason we say 2/3 is because most of these people go around in gangs of three. Two of them do the work and the other one's a labourer. So we felt it was a little bit unfair to ask the third person, who's maybe a young person just joined, but inevitably in time that person will progress through the career and then into this training scheme. But the other thing your members will be pleased to know is that we insist our manufacturer members only use erectors that have gone through this program.
Okay.
So what we're trying to do is give people confidence that if you use an STA member, you are not only getting an audited manufactured system, but you're also getting alongside that trained installers and erectors.
Yeah, brilliant.
It's about upskilling, Mark. It's about professionalism, and I think we've all had to up the game, haven't we, since Grenfell? Quite rightly. Having said that, I must say that we were on this path before Grenfell. In fact, for the 14 years I've been in place, the health and safety agenda item has been front and centre for our sector.
Yeah. Well, I think we've all professionalising the sector, something we've both been at for some time.
It is.
So
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. Sandra, if I'm a main contractor and I realise that we've got to double the amount of timber that we use across everything, and don't forget we use timber for all sorts of things, both temporary works as well as permanent. What do you see as the main blockers that's going to start preventing that? Is it, where do you see the main areas that we need to be focusing on to make this reality?
Well, it probably won't surprise you, Mark, because I'm often asked this question, but actually the biggest blocker is cultural. We've always done it this way, is the answer. You need to break through that before you can begin to help people understand what to do, where to go, how to do it. So, and that's something you and I have been involved with since Latham and Egan in the mid-80s. So that answer probably won't surprise you. But once people buy into the fact that timber is a bona fide solution, and you've broken that barrier, then there are lots of places that we can send them for help. Whether that's in our sector with the STA, so timber frame, mass timber, and so on, where we can help ourselves, or if it's for more wide use in the sector, we work very closely with Timber Development UK, and they have an ability to help in things like cladding and so on.
So you would point members for contractors ought to be picking up the phone to STA, the Structural Timber Association, and UK Timber, effectively.
If they used us as a focal point, we'd be very happy, if we can't answer it ourselves, to ask one of our trade association partners. It's something we're doing at the moment with the RIBA for architects, because we understand that more people want to use timber, but many of them won't have designed in timber before. So we're going to be providing what they call a specialist provider service, where we will offer technical assistance, CPD material, to our IBA members, and I'm sure we'd be very happy to do the same for NFB members. So be that first port of call for technical advice, CPD material, and if it's not us that can directly help you, we'll farm it out to one of our partners. We're about hopefully to do the same thing with iStruct as well. So we are identifying, Mark, that one of the obstacles, if you like, to using more timber is lack of knowledge, of education, lack of skills, and obviously we want to do something to help that.
And does your training and awareness extend to the interfaces with your members' products? So it's the ensuring that the interfaces are covered as well.
One of the bigger areas, Mark, of concern over the years, and I when I came into this role 14 years ago, based on my time with Constructing Excellence prior to that, I set up a think tank, which had people on it from all parts of the supply chain, from clients, contractors, house builders, architects, and so on. In fact, I used to call it the Noah's Ark, because I had two of each in those days on the think tank. And basically what I wanted to do with that think tank was, first of all, understand from them what their needs are in terms of using timber, and then also communicate to them what we could do to help. So we can and we will offer technical assistance. We'll offer CPD material. We'll offer factory visits is needed by the supply chain. We are there to help, and we've just beefed up our own internal staffing levels to take account of this, because we know that the opportunities are going to come thick and fast in the next year or so. So we've just appointed a new technical director in July of this year, Up until now, we had it sort of a contractor basis. We've just appointed a new PR manager to deal with communications. I'm just about to appoint a new project director to help me deliver the timber and construction roadmap. So you can see, as an organisation, we really mean business in terms of putting this agenda, because it is the opportunity of a lifetime, Mark. And you know the saying, opportunity of a lifetime has to be grasped in the lifetime of the opportunity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Andrew, just coming on to one of the other areas that I know interests our members is that, if we're refurbishing and retrofitting and sorting problems out on existing buildings, which I think is going to become ever more prevalent, we've got to obviously upcycle or recycle the timber that's going at the moment. At the moment, quite a lot of it just goes in the skip and goes off to be chipped, and depending on what it's been covered with as part of the preservation for it. Are there ways that we can ensure a better recycling or upskilling, better uses for products of timber when they come off their first life?
So again, I can answer that, if I may, in three ways.
Go on then.
The first thing is to talk generally about circularity. And I think all parts of construction are really embracing this now. Let's be honest, Mark, for the first time properly. It's not really been talked about in the way it's talked about now. So a lot of that goes to design, because we have to design for end of use. So I think with regard to new build, that's very much now in people's minds and being considered. I'm not sure, if I'm honest, whether existing buildings are going to be that easy.
No.
That, if I'm very honest, doesn't apply just to timber, but to any building material. Because if a building hasn't been designed for reuse, it's going to be very difficult. However much you want to do it, it's going to be difficult. And you, as an ex-contractor, would know that better than I. So I think we have to be realistic about that. The second point I wanted to make was about, if you like, refurbishment. And what we're seeing is that timber is a very, very good material if you want to build additional stories, for example. I saw a project when I was last in Australia. It was a CLT building of about 6 stories, and they were building another 10 stories above it in Melbourne. And they used timber because it was lightweight, and because obviously it didn't adversely affect the foundations and so on. So I do see a lot of potential for clients that want to build upwards in conurbations, considering timber. But the other point I'd make is that a lot of what you were talking about there, in terms of what I call general use timber, is an example of what actually wouldn't fall under the remit of the STA. That would be more aligned to my colleagues in Timber Development UK. So we're very focused on structural timber. And they deal with everything else, if you like. So I prefer not to answer that, because I'd probably be winging it, which is probably not a good idea for a podcast.
Fair enough. So, Andrew, I'm just trying to, if we can give people a sense of the improvement in carbon per square metre for a building made out of bricks and blocks to one made out of timber. I mean, are you able to give a sort of yardstick for how much improvement we get?
Interestingly, we've looked at this quite recently, because obviously we've had the government target to build 1.5 million homes in the lifetime of the Parliament. I wish them well, and I'm meeting with my new minister next Wednesday to see how we can help. If they achieve it, then I'd say very well done. But I'm giving you that as an initial answer, just to back up a statistic I'm going to give you in a second. So approximately just under 1 ton of carbon is stored for every metre cubed of timber used. So this makes the building stock one of the safest and most effective carbon stores available. But if I align that to the figures I've just given, if those 300,000 new homes per annum were built in timber frame, that would mean we would store about 6 million tons of carbon. So I think that sort of puts it into perspective in terms of what timber can do.
Yeah, and the alternatives are using carbon, not sequestering it, aren't they? So that's
right. That's right.
The other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and in terms of statistics, somewhere between 30 to 50% of carbon emissions of new buildings are through its lifetime, and that could be slashed if we use more sustainable, renewable materials such as timber. I think most people get that now. I don't think there's many people in the construction industry that don't understand that we need to use more timber if we're going to meet the UK's net zero target by 2050. I think it's the how now.
Yeah.
No brown cow involved, but it's the how that we now need to consider.
I think you're right, Richard. I think Andrew, I think the challenge for me, I suppose, is particularly on the housing front, and particularly housing for vulnerable individuals that we might be putting in timber frame buildings, is to be able to manage the heat. And we're building lightweight buildings. We need to make sure that we can keep the heat out as well as keep the heat in during winter. And that's there are ways of doing that. And again, it comes down to the effective design you were talking about earlier. And effective delivery on site. So those challenges can be got.
I mean, many housing associations, social housing providers, and so on, look positively at timber frame because of the energy efficiency credentials, keeping their bills down as residents. But I take your point. The managing of heat, if you want to call it that, during the summer months, for example. But again, it does come down to design. If you're aware of what the implications are, you can design around it, can't you? That's
absolutely
yeah.
So Andrew, I'm very mindful of time. We've had a good sort of journey through some of the opportunities that timber presents. Well, if you're one of my members, if you're a sort of main contractor looking to see how timber should be used more effectively and more efficiently, so what would be the sort of the three things that you might ask them to look at or to go away and investigate?
Okay. Well, the first thing would be to contact the STA, because if they're looking to use structural timber systems for the first time, I would suggest that we're the go-to organisation to find out what they need to know technically, health and safety wise, skills wise, quality wise, etc., etc. So that would be my first ask. My second ask would be to go and see some successful projects that have already been constructed, and there are many of them. I mean, particularly in housing, the layman or laywoman wouldn't know that most of the houses are timber frame, because obviously the timber frame just replaces the internal skin. The external skin is usually still brick. So, go and have a look at some of the successful timber frame constructions that are already there, and they will, I think, be pleasantly surprised with what they see. And then the third thing, once they've spoken to us and once they've been to see a successful project, I think would actually to engage with one of my members, because like everything in construction, Mark, early involvement is critical. And you need to work with the key players, the key supply chain members. And I would say that early involvement of my members would bring huge value if they're going down that path for the first time. So that collaborative approach that you and I know and love, that integrated supply chain, it's the same old messages, but they work, don't they?
They do indeed.
So that would be my three asks. Contact the SDA, go and look at some successful case studies, and then liaise with one of my members.
Sound advice, because it's that collaboration will solve risks both for during construction, but also provide a much more secure building in operation to meet what we've designed buildings for. Andrew, thank you very much indeed for your time today. It's been a great canter through structural timber and all the opportunities that provides. We've clearly got some major opportunities as well ahead of us if we're going to double the amount of structural timber across the industry. And it's clearly something that we're all going to have to get to grips with in a far greater way than we have done hitherto, if we're going to make sure we get to net zero by 2050. But thank you very much for your time.
Okay, Mark, thank you.